glad to welcome you to our conference, Fixing Science, Practical Solutions for the Irreproducibility Crisis, co-sponsored by the National Association of Scholars and the Independent Institute. We're quite pleased to have such a high caliber group of speakers, as well as all of you attending. We look forward to a learned and robust discussion. You can find information on the conference in the printed program, which is this, which was in your registration or kit, or you've been handed it when you registered. It also includes bios of the speakers and a bibliography on the subjects to be addressed this weekend. As background, the Independent Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, scholarly public policy research organization that sponsors in-depth studies of major social and economic issues in order to boldly advance peaceful, prosperous, and free societies with a commitment to human worth and dignity. The results of this work are published as peer-reviewed books and other publications and form the basis for numerous conference and media projects. You'll also find in your registration bag a copy of the current issue of our quarterly journal, The Independent Review, and we hope that you will all subscribe. For the conference scheduled today and tomorrow, we will have 11 sessions, including an opening address today, and our speaker will be introduced in a moment. There will also be presentations at dinner tonight, tomorrow morning after breakfast, and at lunch tomorrow, plus a special closing keynote address tomorrow afternoon. As many of you know, many headline scientific findings in recent years have turned out to be false. They can't be reproduced, and if they can't be reproduced, it isn't science. Such failure is called the Irreproducibility Crisis. It can be the result of improper use of statistics, arbitrary research techniques, lack of accountability, political groupthink, and a scientific culture biased towards producing only positive results. By some estimates, half of recent scientific research could be irreproducible. But this problem has been building for years, at least awareness of it has been building for years. For example, in his 2005 paper, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, Stanford health statistician John Ioannidis noted that, quote, several methodologies have pointed out that in the high rise of non-replication of research studies is a consequence of the convenient yet ill-founded strategy of claiming conclusive research findings solely on the basis of a single study assessed by formal statistical analysis, unquote. In 1996, the NYU physicist Alan Sokal published a now infamous fake paper in the journal Social Text, in which he combined postmodern philosophy with the theory of quantum gravity to claim, quote, physical reality, no less than social reality, is at bottom a social and linguistic construct, unquote. Now known as the Sokal hoax, he showed that postmodern, deconstructivist, radically subjectivist discourse is so meaningless, not even experts can distinguish between people who make sincere claims and those who compose deliberate gibberish. More recently, in 2018, three academics, James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, and Peter Boghossian, inspired by the work of Sokal, wrote 20 fake papers in what they called grievance studies, using deliberately absurd jargon to argue for unsubstantiated conclusions. 7 of their papers were accepted for publication in ostensibly serious peer-reviewed journals. 4 were in revise and resubmit stages, and only 6 were rejected until the media reported on the hoax, and suddenly 3 more were rejected. Defending on what now is called the Sokal squared, social psychologist Jonathan Haidt said, quote, the project was undertaken because there is a long-running and colossal violation of academic integrity in a few departments in the academy. There's a disciplinary norm in some fields and journals of publishing papers that take a particular political or moral position, whether or not they have scholarly merit. That was Alan Sokal's point in his hoax paper. As long as he seemed to be taking a social constructionist point of view, it didn't matter that the editors could not understand what had been written. Boghossian and his colleagues undertook a long, time-consuming, and career-risking project to stand up for academic integrity, by exposing what is arguably an academic subculture that tolerates intellectual fraud, unquote. And Harvard political scientist Yashit Monk said, quote, what they have shown in that certain journals, and perhaps to an extent certain fields, can't distinguish between serious scholarship and a ridiculous intellectual hoax, unquote. He further described a, quote, circling of the academic wagons, quote, unquote, to malign the hoaxers, noting that, quote, one thing remains incontestable in my mind. Any academic who is not at least a little troubled about the case with which hoaxers pass satire off as wisdom has fallen foul to the same kind of motivated reasoning and naked partisanship that is currently engulfing the country as a whole, unquote. Our Fixing Science conference is bringing together scholars from several disciplines to talk about practical ways to restore the enterprise of science. Sessions will explore how the irreproducibility crisis affects specific disciplines, including economic, health, and environmental sciences. Other panels will examine topics such as groupthink, paradigm narratives, and falsifiability. Throughout, we wish to focus on which reforms have worked so far to help us craft and propose initiatives to assist in advancing practical solutions to the irreproducibility crisis by scientists, civil society, and lawmakers. So without further ado, and joining me in welcoming you, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Peter Wood. Peter is president of the National Association of Scholars, which has over 2,700 academic members. Peter received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Rochester, and he's former provost of the King's College in New York. Winner of the Caldwell Award for Leadership in Higher Education, he's the author of numerous books as well as several hundred articles in print and online journals. He's also the publisher of the Association's quarterly journal, Academic Questions, and hosts the Association's weekly podcast, Curriculum Vitae. We're very pleased to be working with the National Association of Scholars. Please join me in welcoming Peter Wood.
Thank you, David, and thank you, members of the audience. I'm grateful to the Independent Institute for making this event possible and for teaming up with the National Association of Scholars to venture into this perilous territory. I'd also like to thank Graham Walker, the Executive Director of the Independent Institute. Without his help, we would have had a harder time fixing science. But by the end of this program, of course, it will all be fixed. I stand between you and an exciting program, and I'm going to be one of those social bores that will hold you up for at least a few minutes before we get started into the real science. I think the place to begin is with the controversy that brought at least some of you here. That is, a few weeks ago, when our conference didn't have that many registrants to it, and we thought we were just going to be putting on a quiet little event, a Dr. Leonid Teitelman, not sure how to say his name, decided that this was an event that was insufferable and had to be stopped. He first posted that opinion on his blog, and then he wrote to many of the speakers of the event and gave a series of reasons why they should withdraw and make this event a canceled one. Those four reasons were, first of all, that there were no women speakers on the platform of speakers. He didn't bother to find out why that was. We had invited a good number of women, but as things fell out, the people who accepted and the people who were doing work in this field turned out to be mostly men. It now happens that we do have a woman on the program, and I'm happy about that. But I'm happy because that's a person who belongs here, not because she's of the right gender. The second reason why Dr. Teitelman thought we should not proceed was that the initials of our organization, the National Association of Scholars, happened to be rather similar to the initials of the National Academy of Sciences in Engineering and Medicine. And that he wanted to be sure that the speakers knew this in advance because he believed that we'd hoodwinked them, and people were coming because they thought this was a National Academy of Sciences event, and aha, we aren't. Well, true, we aren't. I don't find that to be a particularly worrisome thing. We've been called the National Association of Scholars since our founding in 1987. We've gone by the initials NAS from our very first newsletter, also in 1987. As far as I know, there's nobody in the world who's ever been confused for more than a nanosecond about the distinction between these two organizations. But if you are here in this room thinking that this is the National Academy of Sciences, now is the time to stand up and walk out in indignation. I don't blame you one bit. You fell for our ruse, and now you know. Well, the third reason that the event should be canceled was that the National Association of Scholars, he declared, is a climate-denying organization. Now, I don't believe I've ever denied the existence of climate in my entire life, but to be less facetious about that, the National Association of Scholars takes no position, no position at all on climate change, how much of it exists, what its causes are, what its remedies might be. We're a kind of free-thinking organization, one that welcomes argument and dispute. The part of the controversies surrounding climate change that concerns us is the banning of people who express any degree of skepticism. So we go out of our way to make sure that the skeptics are included, along with people who hold to the climate consensus view, so-called. Generally speaking, we welcome controversy in a world that has become controversy allergic. Well, the fourth reason is related to the third, which is that Mr. Teitelman looked at our program and saw that a good many of our speakers have nothing to do with climate science, one way or the other, and some of them are actually pretty orthodox upholders of the standard views in this field. But he took that to mean that we were tricking all those legitimate scientists into showing up at an event where we were going to be sneaking in bogus science and thus giving legitimacy or a platform to the bogus science. Well, I think all of the speakers now know pretty much what the lay of the land is, and you're not being tricked about anything. I think the one way in which we've tried to trick everybody is that this is a conference that really touches on intellectual history, philosophy, social policy, under the guise of being a science conference. But I think the scientists understand that as well, that science doesn't stay in a little box, it affects all of society. And this is an occasion where we're going to be addressing some problems that reach beyond that. Now, in answering Dr. Teitelman, I think I've probably introduced the National Association of Scholars as much as you need. A few more words about it, though. We are a membership organization. I'm pleased to say, since David last looked at our website, our membership has grown by about another 400, so we're a 3,100 member organization, and I hope it'll be a little bit larger after the next 2 days. So you're welcome to join if you'd like to. National Association of Scholars doesn't do just science. We are a reform-minded organization that touches just about every aspect of higher education and increasingly K-12 education as well. So, for example, we just held a conference at Pepperdine 2 weeks ago, which was on the lost history of Western civilization. And we're very much involved in the dispute over the New York Times' so-called 1619 project, in which they declare that the presence of slaves in Jamestown in 1619 was the true founding of America. So that's the kind of thing we do, and you can learn a lot more about us from our website or from talking to me or the other members of the organization who are here, which includes, among others, Richard Vedder, who is a member of our board. And the topic, I think, has been adequately introduced already. That is, we're talking about irreproducibility, and if you can say that word 3 times fast, you get a discount on your membership. The question of irreproducibility, in my mind, is really a question about the authority of science. There's nothing more authoritative in our republic than science. Everybody makes a claim to the authority of science. Why? Because science is the closest we come to a public understanding of what truth is. And even if truth has now been battered a bit by postmodernists and people who think that it should never be taken as an absolute, truth is still something that matters very much to the American people. And the way we govern ourselves through a vast regulatory apparatus depends to a great degree on discovering what the truth is. If someone is making a claim about an environmental hazard, we would like that claim to be founded on the best possible science. If someone is making a claim that there is no possibility of a visible light laser, it's a good thing if someone actually invents one and shows that it can be done. So scientific breakthroughs, the advancement of science become something that matters greatly to the innovation of the technology in our society, as well as the way in which we govern ourselves. Now, how in the world do I get to say this as an anthropologist? Anthropology, I would have to say, probably has particular authority when it comes to talking about fraud and non-reproducibility. We've been at it longer than any other science. Dare I mention Margaret Mead? We can invent things so freely because nobody expects to reproduce it. You go off to a jungle and live for 2 years, learn the native language, and come back and say whatever you want. Who's going to gainsay you? It's a wonderful field. And you know, I can't praise it highly enough, but at some point you get kind of thirsty for actually knowing what's there rather than just making up stories about it. So at this point, I'm a kind of ex-anthropologist. But let me put it in good word for it anyway. As anthropology has gone down the postmodern drain, there's a piece of anthropology that connects with human biology that has made astonishing advances. We live in an age now, through the recovery of ancient DNA, when we know more about the deep human past than it was ever imaginable even 20 or 30 years ago. And that aspect of anthropology continues to unfold. So even in a discipline as corrupt as mine, good science can be done. Now, I think I should say a word or two, or maybe more than that, about why we're doing this now. There are conflicting views about the irreproducibility crisis. There are respectable people arguing that there is no such crisis, or irreproducibility has been with the sciences from the beginning. It's always there. Why treat it as a crisis now? Well, there are these studies that show an alarming number of published papers are irreproducible. Those need to be taken into account, but is that any different from the way it was 100 years ago? Who knows? Nobody's actually done that. I do think that there are some conditions that affect the way science is done today that may make the problem harder. We now deal in the realms of the very small, the even smaller, the smaller still, the very large, the very, very large, the near but inaccessible, the very various, the heterogeneity of things, the hard to visualize, the very fast, very slow, and the very complex. Well, science has always had an eye for these sorts of things, but technology has driven us to the point where we can measure things that would have just been considerably immeasurable in the past. That also opens up the possibility for lots of mistakes and lots of doubts. If we're measuring things in the parts per trillion, who's to really say we're getting it right? We have to trust a bunch of people that we don't know very well, and frequently we find they're not very trustworthy. They make things up. Not maybe as much as anthropologists do, but still. Well, that's not to say that science has solved all the interesting problems that exist in the human scale, the ordinary phenomenal world around us. There's still plenty of interesting questions there to be made. But I think that when we deal with the question of why now, we have to realize that science is doing more difficult things more often, and that leaves the door open for a lot more mistakes. So I want to maybe just add to that a little bit on what I expect to hear over the next 2 days. The dangers that we face, some of them are self-evident. There are people who commit conscious fraud. They do so in search for money or acclaim to advance their careers. There's others who are engaged in a kind of self-delusion. They're just so sure they're right that they proceed as though that's a given that they're right. And I think there's a lot of that around. And I also think, and I don't have quite a single word for this, but there's a combination of fraud and self-delusion, fraud delusion, something, in which the scientist believes he knows the right answer, has done valid work trying to get to the right answer, and things just don't quite work out right. So he nudges the data a little bit, fudges here and there. And he tells himself, it's okay because this is the right answer, and if I don't get it quite right, the next person will. My procedures might be a little shaky, but we're on the right path here, and what's the harm of announcing this result? So self-delusion and fraud come together. Step by step, that person sinks into a quicksand of supposition that others are going to walk on or even try to build on. And that's one of the reasons we end up with a version of science that is just not really going to be usable at all. Well, those are sort of questions of intent, the fraud, self-delusion, and the combination of them. There's other things that happen. There's inadvertence of various kinds, the incompetence of a person who doesn't really know how to use statistics very well, maybe engaged in p-hacking and not knowing that it's p-hacking. And then there are just simple mistakes that we all make. Well, at least all you make. I don't make them. The causes of this, we're going to hear a lot about that. The groupthink, the willingness to go along with what your peers are saying, the vanity of not wanting to admit making mistakes. I don't have any of that. Just plain greed, and this desire to advance yourself. What stands in the way? What are the obstacles? Some of them are inertial. There is just the magic orthodoxy of staying with whatever has been written in the textbooks and that you grew up with, and you want to challenge that. That's difficult. But now we face also political orthodoxy, the decision that you can't say that because it's going to give help and aid to bad people. The typical version of this is that it's somehow going to hurt climate science or hurt environmental science to come up with a result that doesn't fit with the current agenda. And there are vested economic interests. I've just been signaled by Chance, who has a wonderful first name, that I'm out of time, and I've held you up long enough from what really lies ahead. So let me hand off to David Randall, who will introduce our first speaker, Nathan Schachman. Thank you.